Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and last meeting of the Mediated Memories of Responsibility seminar series. I'm Guido Bartolini, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in Italian Studies at University College Cork, and I'm the curator of this seminar series, which I've co-organized together with Joe Ford and from MLR and Selina Daly from Royal Holloway University of London. I have to thank, all of you for being here, and especially, if you have also attended or other meetings before. As you probably know, this is a seminar series, that is focused on the idea of responsibility for the past and trying to address and study how cultural products engage with past injustices and can have a role in raising awareness about the past. And I will not add much more to introduce this session, because today, compared to the other meetings, we have a more numerous panel, because we are going to listen to 4 speakers. So I will just limit myself to give you a few practical information that are the usual information that you always hear when you attend an online event. So please always make sure to have your microphone muted. I will introduce the speakers individually, and each one of them will talk for roughly 15 minutes. At the end of these 15 minutes, we are going to have then a Q&A. And for the Q&A, you can always use the chat, and this will be open throughout the entire event. So if you have comments, if you want to formulate a question, you can always write it down in the chat, and then later we will get back to it. And if you want, you will be asked to come on screen and ask the question yourself, or we will just rely on what you wrote on the chat. In case you want to write a question anonymously, you can write it to me still in the chat, just addressing me. And I just remind you that the event is recorded, so in case you don't want to appear on camera, you should just keep it off, of course. And the last final aspect is just to stress, that the event, we were lucky to receive funds and financial support from UCML, University Council of Modern Languages, and the HARI, the Arts and Humanities Research Institute of Royal Holloway University of London, which I thank for the support that they gave to this seminar series. So without further ado, I will just introduce the first speaker of today, who is Professor Alison Ribeiro de Menezes from University of Warwick. And Alison is Professor of Hispanic Studies, and her research focuses on issues of cultural memory in Spain, Portugal, and Chile. She has written widely on contemporary Spanish and Portuguese culture, and her most recent monograph is Embodying Memory in Contemporary Spain from 2014. She was also the principal investigator of an HRC-funded network grant on Chilean exiles who came to the UK following the 1973 coup d'etat. Currently, she is collaborating with Professors Antonio Cazorla Sanchez and Adrian Schubert on a public engagement project to design a virtual museum of the Spanish Civil War. And I think that we are going to hear more about this project, because indeed, the title of her talk today is Developing a Virtual Museum of the Spanish Civil War, Public History and Memory.
Okay, Guido, thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers, yourself, Joe, and Selina, for this invitation. And just to say that I'm a little worried about my internet, so I hope it's going to survive, but let me know if you can't hear me. And there's also the other inevitable COVID comment, which is to say that this project should be much more advanced. And so I would love to be able to share screenshots or explore the website with you, but it's a good 6 or 8 months delayed. So what I'm going to do is reflect on what it is like, if you like, to be a memory studies scholar starting an engagement project like this, and the thoughts that are particularly in my mind. And I want to reflect on the practice of public history and memory work, stating from the beginning I'm not a public historian, nor yet a historian, but that I'm collaborating with 2 well-known historians of the Civil War and a wider team. As you may know, Spain has no national museum to the Spanish Civil War, and what could be called a relatively weak tradition of public history. But yet since 2000, more or less, there have been quite intense civic debates surrounding the legacies of the Civil War and the Franco dictatorship, and quite active memory campaigns to seek symbolic and legal redress for historical violence, atrocities, and crimes. So it's within this context that I want to think about what it means to develop a project about an online museum or a digital resource of the war that might bring together the practice of public engagement and memory work. And I take that term from Elizabeth Yellen, the Argentine memory scholar. Our overarching goal is pretty straightforward, with thanks to funding from the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. We're effectively trying to create a virtual exhibit or the beginnings of a virtual exhibit that will synthesize existing knowledge and that will increase accessibility and discoverability for primary sources. So the exhibits are a range of sources, and I can talk a bit more about those perhaps in the questions, and to reach a wider Spanish public. We're doing this somewhat unexpectedly in the context of the proposition of a new and a second law of memory in Spain, proposed by the current government to be called a Bill of Democratic Memory. I haven't time to go into this notion of democratic memory except very briefly, but it arises out of a broad range of autonomous, by which I mean the Spanish regional autonomous government's efforts to engage in this broader idea of memory work. But first I'd like to say a few things about public history, at least as it seems to me to be relevant to the question. Public historians seem to agree that this is a very slippery term, defined as much by what it is not, that is, if you like, ivory tower based history, as by what it actually is. The things that strike me of most relevance are the fact that public history has a focus on audience and reception. The word public, of course, implies a history that reaches outside academia and engages actors and actions in the field. But of course, what those public or publics are is a question to be considered. Second, it focuses on engaging or doing, or on a practice of making history in a range of forms and for different purposes. This sort of participatory model, I think, might be seen as democratic and as containing a potential for social transformation, as for instance, Keane and Martin view it in their 2013 volume, The Public History Reader. It's echoed again in the mission of the journal, The Public Historian, dating right back to 1978 in the US, where public history, it says, examines the use of history in the present moment, rather than examining the past for its own sake. And it is this, I would suggest, that brings it close to the field of memory studies. Public history can expose, excuse me, fracture lines between inclusivity and exclusivity, who gets to speak about their past, who is able to hear them, whose insight and expertise counts most, and perhaps whose least or less. Public history also raises the question not only of who historians are engaging with and how, but the socio-political structures and the policy frameworks that underpin the activity. And I think also important in relation to Spain and those references to the autonomous regions, it can also engage with particular conceptions of nation and national identity that might lie behind them. There's a further challenge in Spain, as someone has put it succinctly, it's not the same to remember in a dictatorship as in a democracy, which means that the legacy of war memory in Spain is a complex one. The 2007 Law of Historical Memory, the original one that was passed, tackled the legacy of Francoist memory and allied this to the transitions or the transition to democracy's supposed lack of memory. It tackled it to an extent. And the proposed new law of democratic memory, along with, you may have seen recently, the removal of Franco from the mausoleum, the Valley of the Fallen, continues on a road towards greater public clarity for what both Cazorla Sanchez and Adrian Schubert, my collaborators, have termed Spain's difficulty with, quote, sites without memory and memory without sites. As I said, in the past 2 decades, regional autonomous governments, civic organizations, academic research groups have all tried to address this lack and problem along with some national initiatives. And so there are a range of smaller museums. There's a museum of the bombing of Guernica. There's the organization Democratic Memory in Barcelona. There are various similar small organizations in Andalusia, a museum of the Battle of the Ebro Valley in Aragon, for instance. But one could argue that these remain isolated islands of public history making with a limited impact in the civic sphere. And it's in this sense, I think, that we hope using a digital or virtual platform might extend range. Democratic memory, as it was formulated largely in the Catalan case, but also later, is a defense of democracy. But I think it's also a more democratic public and civic approach to the past. And in this, in thinking about Spain, it echoes what is often termed precisely public history, skewed with the intersections of politics, first, as I hinted, during the dictatorship, but then during the transition to democracy as well. So the task of any public historian in Spain must be entangled with issues relating to how particular accounts became embedded in public awareness. And this is perhaps, of course, the issue of all public history, but I think in Spain is particularly acute. Public history in Spain also faces a dilemma regarding engagement. In a context in which memory horizons and interpretations were first of all state manipulated under the regime, with force, hatred and repression, and then shaped by a broad political consensus during the transition, the question, if I can put it this way, of spectator agency actually becomes problematic. It's not simply a matter of combating silence and forgetting, it's also a matter of trust, or indeed lack of trust in government, evident in the muted and rather ambivalent response of civic memory organizations in relation to this new proposed law. Many accounts of public history stress its emphasis on shared authority, although they note that's not straightforward. But how does one share authority with publics, in the plural, when the topic of debate, such as the Spanish Civil War, is politically contested and has been subject to state-mandated memory policies since the time of the events themselves? Furthermore, in the present era, which has been termed the era of the witness, the importance of testimony as a form of enacting justice for historical violations, which I take to be potentially socioeconomic, political, involving human rights, poverty, or social opportunity. In an era like this, the value attributed to first-person testimony has grown. This means that the authority or reliability of testimonies, which is not quite the same as their value, becomes an issue to be negotiated, and indeed often negotiated publicly. So in the midst of such a politically nuanced question as the Spanish Civil War, and of also the questions of history and memory and their relationship, I find myself thinking about the role of academics who work in these fields. How do we negotiate, to create a potentially false binary for just a moment, but how do we negotiate the top-down aspects of normative history generated by governments and the bottom-up aspects arising from citizen engagement, as well as the many grey zones in between? As long ago as 1996, David Glasberg raised a series of issues in relation to public history and its intersections with memory, including this question of access to the public sphere. We need, he argued, to understand, quote, how public history simultaneously reproduces the unequal political relationships of a society through the relative power of groups in society to have their version of history accepted as the public history, and how it serves as an instrument through which those relationships might be transformed. End of quote. In the Spanish context, Jo Labanyi formulated this as partly a question of listening. The so-called amnesia of the transition, she suggests, is not so much a forgetting as a lack of audience for those willing to speak out. So it's a question of understanding not only the mediation of memory, but its reception. How do those who do engage with public history interpret what they are presented with? What is the role of intermediaries, such as researchers, in guiding these interpretations? And let me state straight away, I don't have the answers to these. but it seemed to me relevant to the topic of mediated memories of responsibility, because the word responsibility needs to encompass not only an examination of historical responsibility for atrocity, or the responsibility of memory, indeed, in ensuring non-repetition, the notion of never again, but also the responsibility of memory's entrepreneurs, if I can take Elizabeth Yellen's term, and the question that such entrepreneurs might well include researchers and scholars ourselves. So I'm interested in the notion of memory work, which emphasizes memory as practice and comes close to public history, but as something that is also grounded in subjective engagements and subject to disputes, conflicts, and struggles. Yellen argues that such a perspective, of course, focuses on the, quote, active and productive role of participants in these struggles, and it is those people she names entrepreneurs. I'm using the word a little bit more broadly in the present context to suggest that it's not simply activists or those who want to make claims, but that in the current climate or in the current context, the line between scholarship and activism is becoming increasingly blurred. Partly, I think, through scholarly commitment, and indeed within the UK, at least impact agendas, but also as so-called culture wars develop, increasingly putting academics and writers, sometimes unwillingly, often unwillingly perhaps, on the front line in debates that emerge from their work. And perhaps the most relevant at the moment are questions, of course, of colonial legacies, racism, and anti-Semitism. I'm not intending here to privilege scholars over the entrepreneurs whom Yellen lists, notably in her case, human rights groups, victims and relatives above all. I just want to note that the terrain is shifting with respect to academic objectivity and involvement, and that this particularly affects those of us working on issues of memory and working in the domain of public history. We are, in short, being drawn into questions of who owns memory, whose history, who has the right to comment. And anybody who has worked with those memory entrepreneurs in Yellen's sense will be very aware of this. From my own point of view, it seems to me that the practice of memory confronts the historicization, the practice of public history confronts the historicization and thus the analysis of memories. And in the latter case, contextualizing memory work potentially relativizes its moral claims. Yet such contextualization remains necessary in order to understand those claims and their particular validity. There's another dimension, I think, to the scholar as entrepreneur, and that is her presence as shaping and guiding ego within the research and engagement process. Or if I can put it the way one of my colleagues, James Hodgkinson, does when he was writing about his work on a ref impact project. He says, "It was only through self-critique that I would begin to succeed in the project's last stages, in balancing my own voice as researcher with the voices of my collaborators." Hodgkinson talks of a two-way porosity between the academy and the non-academic constituencies that we might work with. And I think this recalls the question of shared authority within the fields of public history. It may well be then that academic entrepreneurship can play an important role in Spain's memory debates and in the development of more extensive public history. But of course, as scholars, we need to be sure to listen to the publics we engage, which of course doesn't leave us knowing which publics we might end up engaging. We need to think about who they are. We need to engage and gain their trust. And we also need to deal with their expectations and needs. So very briefly, just to think of some of the particular issues that so far come to mind in trying to put forward a digital resource of the war. And we're drawing to a certain extent on Serge Noret and his notions of digital public history. So that's behind some of these. But one has to deal with the question of the need for digital curation. This question of contextualizing requires certain choices and certain interpretations, which might come down to citing dead, the numbers of dead in battles and various atrocities, all of which are disputed, but yet in a museum one might not footnote and so on. There are sort of minor issues of accessibility and copyright, of course. There's a question of building trust with our collaborators. And in a context such as this, some groups are notably hesitant and understandably hesitant to agree to loans or be involved without certain assurances as to our positioning as scholars and researchers in relation to the exhibits that we might display in relation to those groups. One of the areas that we haven't tackled yet, but that we plan to do, is to allow crowdsourced entries, which of course means, again, the question of curation and brings a scientific element to the choice of how these might be presented. A surprising element that has emerged is not just the question of shared authority, but actually ownership, because when you have a state moving in the question of memory work, there is also a question of the extent to which we get drawn into state policies rather than, and to what extent we might actually be assisting with those. And of course, these policies change with each different government. So there's a line to negotiate there. Noré talks about the need to build in reflexivity in creating a digital public history. And it's very hard to do that, I think, and we need to think hard about how you do that when you have short entries of 500 or 600 words related to an object. So there's a question around there, I think, about us being able somehow to make accessible the process that we need to go through to think about constructing this museum. And a very last point, and with this I'll finish, it seems to me that one of the things that we will need to think about from the memory angle isn't just what we present, but if we bear in mind that scholars of memory have argued that memory isn't reactivation, but actually a recreation of a past moment, to what extent might our intervention actually create memories? And therefore start to determine the field. And I think this is actually an area for future study and audience engagement. Might we find ourselves tackling, as there is in an excellent article by Gardner and Henry about the National Museum of American History confronting 9/11, might we find ourselves drawn into these particular questions and shaping views about the Spanish Civil War? So I don't have any answers to all of these, but I'll throw them out as issues that perhaps you, as interested scholars and people who work in the field, might find useful to come in and discuss. So thank you very much. I hope I've stayed to time. I hope you heard it all, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Alison, especially for posing questions, I mean, that, as you said, are relevant, I mean, for all of us. I mean, we should all kind of think somehow and engage with them, I mean, although then finding answers are sometimes difficult. And then I just want to say, I mean, that your connection was perfect, so the quality was great. We heard everything, so no worries on that side too. Okay, then we are going to move to the second speaker, and then there will be plenty of time for the discussion later on. So our second speaker is Dr. Diana Popa from Tallinn University. Diana, she's a postdoctoral research fellow on the European Research Council Starting Grant project, Translating Memories, the Eastern European Past in the Global Arena, in which she explores how contemporary historical films from Romania and Hungary contribute to transmitting the memory of the authoritarian past beyond national boundaries. Previously, she was still an ERC postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Edinburgh as part of the project Illuminating the Grey Zone, addressing complex complicity in human rights violations. Diana received her PhD in film studies from the University of St. Andrew, and her research interests lie in the relationship between film and socio-historical and political context, film style and aesthetics, slow cinema, and transnational cinemas. The title of her talk today is Spectacular Provocations, Spectatorship and Responsibility in Rado Jude's Historical Films.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Guido, for your introduction, and for the organizer for the opportunity to present my research in this wonderful environment. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so in this presentation, I propose an analysis of spectacle as a constitutive element of two films, Aferim, which came out in 2015, and îmi este indiferent dacă în istorie vom intra ca barbari, or in English, I do not care if we go down in history as barbarians, which came out in 2018 by the same filmmaker, Radu Jude. These are two historical films that are set in the distant past and deal with difficult and little addressed topics, such as the Roma slavery in the Romanian provinces in the 19th century and the massacre of Jews at Odessa in 1941. I argue that a discussion of spectacle opens up the possibility of analyzing spectatorial positions in relation to the cinematic narratives that the films develop, a necessary step in addressing the complexities of historical and political responsibility. Aferim is a black and white costume drama that occupies an in-between position as both mainstream and also art house cinematic production. The film uses visual and narrative tropes that makes the association with the Western genre instantly recognizable. For example, the journey by horse of a constable, a policeman of the time, called Constantin and played by Teodor Corban, and his son Ioniță, played by Mahaiko Manoiu, amidst spectacular scenery. The constable and his son are hired by a boyar called Iordache and played by Alexandru Dabija to find and return a fugitive Roma slave, whose name is Carfin and is played by Toma Cuzin, suspected of having slept with the boyar's wife. This journey provides the context for an exploration of the society of the times, which is Wallachia in 1835, and its predominantly racist mentalities and behaviors, as preserved in classic Romanian literary texts, which are still part of the curricula in high schools in Romania. The dialogue is loosely based on these classic literary texts and are interspersed with popular sayings and proverbs, which add a sense of the spectacular to this visually flamboyant historical film. I do not care if we go down in history as barbarians intervenes into the debates on the memory of the Holocaust from a specific Eastern European perspective. Barbarians is set in the present, in contemporary Romania, but its subject matter revolves around a historical event, the massacre of Jews at Odessa by the Romanian army in 1941. The title of the film quotes a sentence taken from a political speech made during the war, which details the Romanian government's plans for ethnic cleansing via population exchange, deportation to Transnistria, and murder. Thus, the film reenacts not only the brutal killings of Jews by shooting, hanging, and burning, but also, and more significantly, the anti-Semitic nationalism that allowed for this event to happen. As the official poster of the film suggests, this shameful episode in Romanian history is left unaddressed in contemporary political debates, obscured by years of communist myth-making, and almost entirely absent from history textbooks. The film's present perspective is important for two reasons. First, it emphasizes a continuous lack of awareness and absence of accountability for the crimes perpetuated by the Romanian army against Romanian and Ukrainian Jews on the Eastern Front. Second, it connects this lack of awareness with a larger issue, the memory of the World War II in the Romanian cultural consciousness, more precisely the politics of forgetting or selective remembering encouraged and supported by communist and post-communist historiography. For most of the war, Romania, under the military dictatorship of Marshal Ion Antonescu, fought alongside Nazi Germany, but ended the war on the side of the Allies. Communist myth-making, combined with lack of access to archives during communism, is largely responsible for rewriting the history and constructing a collective memory according to which Romanians fought against Nazi Germany alongside the Soviet army. For 2 decades after 1989, the hegemony of often anti-Semitic anti-communism as a dominant framework for understanding the past entrenched the erasure of the memory of the Holocaust and contributed to perpetuating denial, postponing Romania's public reckoning with its participation in it. At the center of the narrative is Mariana Marin, played by Ioana Iacob, a theater director who aims to reenact the massacre of Jews in the form of a public spectacle. The film makes a point of Mariana's hiring Roma people amongst the non-professional actors. In this way, the film acts as a reminder that the Holocaust aimed to exterminate not only Jews, but also the Roma and the Sinti, an Eastern European specificity often neglected in the global memory of the Holocaust. The film is over 2 hours long, but the actual reenactment, which forms the focus of my analysis today, takes place in the last 30 minutes of the film. Despite their many differences, the two films share an interest in exploring subject positions embodied by characters that go beyond the familiar victim-perpetrator dichotomy. These films foreground characters who are not the victims of institutionalized forms of violence. They are not Roma or Jews, but are bystanders to the violence perpetrated in the past, Constantine and his son, and beneficiaries of these violent histories in the present, Mariana and the spectators to the reenactment. I'm interested in discussing how these films use this subject position and spectacle subversively in order to reveal the roots of anti-Roma racism or to question the persistence of problematic myths about the past. Judith Pildner characterizes Aferim as a historical drama at the juncture of theoretical discourses, heritage film, auteur film, and genres, historical film, Western, road movie. For the purposes of this presentation, I will only refer to its association with the heritage film. As Andrew Hickson and Jeanette Vinsondeau point out, characteristic of the heritage film are high production values, lavish spectacle of sets and costumes, commercial success, and more problematically, a tendency to support conservative views on the historical past. The sets in Aferim are the result of the work of Marius Panduru, the director of photography, who used 35mm high-contrast black and white photography to reconstruct 19th century Wallachia through widescreen spectacular compositions. Costume design adds textural density and authenticity to this world of the past. The costumes created by Dana Paparouz are representative of the historical period in which the film takes place. They were also exhibited in 2015 in Bucharest at the Cotroceni Palace, and this is from where the images are taken from. The costumes are not only historically accurate, but are also lavish creations characterized by a colorful and elaborate design, partly lost in black and white. I argue that Aferim retains the spectacular elements characteristic of heritage film, but it departs from this in the way in which it subverts the nationalist views of the past usually associated with the genre. In the Romanian context, this means that instead of representing the Romanians as unified and heroically fighting against a foreign oppressor, the usual subject matter of the historical epic films of the Ceausescu era, Aferim represents Romanians as perpetrators and bystanders to racist acts of violence against the Roma population. Through its more conventional mainstream format, Aferim provides an immersive experience to the viewer, who for most of the film's duration may be fooled by the playful and irreverent tone of the narrative and its spectacular visuals into ignoring its violent undercurrent. Aferim is a film steeped in violence, both verbal and physical. Violence flares up regularly in the film. It is almost exclusively directed at the Roma population, anticipating the brutality at the end of the film when Carfin, down here, the fugitive Roma's genitals are cut off as punishment for sleeping with the boyar's wife. The brutal punishment is not directly shown. Many characters obscure the view, but the violence penetrates the scene nevertheless. The punishment is administered by the boyar himself, and with the help and active involvement of other slaves, some of whom pin down Carfin in this image here, and also in the presence of Constantine and his son, who are the boyar's subordinates. Constantine and Dionitsa occupy the position of passive bystanders, as well as most of other characters in the scene. They appear to have no authority over the boyar and do not intervene to stop him. In contrast to how the events in Aferim remain safely contained in the world of the past that the film carefully constructs, Barbarians foregrounds the privileged role of the spectator through the reenactment. The reenactment is a multimedia event performed in front of an audience, in other words, a spectacle. It represents the climactic moment of the film, the event that we have spent most of the film waiting for, and for which the film created a lot of anticipation to the form that it will take given its content. This last section of the film is shot on garish video, which contributes to creating the stylized and theatrical representation of the Battle of Odessa. This reenactment is punctuated by rousing speeches to the troops delivered by an Orthodox priest and also the military dictator Marshal Ion Antonescu, and monologues quoting at length from official documents of the time, including a telegram which contains specific instructions as to how and when the killings should be organized. These quotes provide the documentary evidence of the massacre in the context of the show. The reenactment is entitled Nașterea unei națiuni, which translates as the birth of a nation. The title immediately recalls the famous 1915 film, classic film by D.W. Griffith, famous for providing an immersive experience of the Civil War battlefield and also for its blatantly racist content. The title is projected at the beginning of the spectacle on the facade of one of the buildings that delineate the public Bucharest Square where the reenactment takes place. Thus, the reenactment in the film captures the birth of the Romanian nation as a moment mired in verbal and physical violence against Jews and implicitly the Roma population. Barbarians not only reenacts the killings of the Romanian and Ukrainian Jews, but also, and more significantly, it proposes the killing and deportation, the anti-Semitism and the anti-Roma racism in Romania during the Holocaust as a crucial moment when ideas about national identity crystallized. This is the film's spectacular provocation to its audiences. The reenactment also calls attention to the spectators, to the presence of the audience, whose reactions are also recorded and included in the show. Their reactions may or may not have been scripted. The film is purposefully ambiguous about this. The close-ups and media shots allow the keen observer to identify the filmmaker himself, Radu Jude, a well-known theater director, Janina Carbunariu, and some of the actors who appear in the film as members of the audience. On the one hand, their presence might be financially motivated. They simply supply more bodies in the crowd. On the other hand, their presence makes their reaction to the show more difficult to interpret as their position is confusing. Are they actors playing or characters playing a role and following instructions, or are their reactions spontaneous? More importantly, perhaps, the spectatorial reactions are rarely uniform or unanimous, and this holds significance for interpreting the effect of the spectacular on the audience. And I will briefly illustrate this point by referring to a key moment of the reenactment, the massacre of Jews by burning. The killing by burning is visually the most spectacular as well as the most disturbing part of the show. The extended focus on the burning flames suggests a particular form of cinematic attraction, the special effects-led spectacle, as Geoff King theorizes it in the context of Hollywood blockbusters. King occupies an important position in the discussion of spectacle in narrative cinema because he proposes an analysis of spectacle in conjunction with, rather than divorced from, narrative content. He argues that outbursts of spectacle and special effects are narratively situated, they serve narrative purposes, and they gain their full impact by through their location at narratively heightened moments of tension. In this sense, the killing by burning follows the roundup of Jews, a heightened moment of tension in itself. In addition, the representation of massacre is also what antagonized most of the characters in the film in the preparation for the reenactment part of the film, including Movila, who acts as a sort of producer for the show. Throughout the film, Mariana has to justify over and over again choosing these episodes from Romanian history. The successful staging of the show, including the killing of Jews at Odessa, is the result of Mariana's dogged persistence as well as a ploy between her and Traian, the leader of the reenactors. The show takes place, but the audience do not react as Mariana was hoping. Some are seemingly enjoying the spectacle, recording the visually striking moment of the flames engulfing the wooden barn on their smartphones, visibly enthralled. Some appear more reflective and critical of the attraction of the spectacle and more aware of what it represents, the reenactment of a massacre, while some even express support for the Jewish victims in the show. This strategy of including spectatorial reactions into the reenactment serves a double function. On the one hand, this strategy contributes to inscribing the act of looking into the spectacle, which makes the extra-diegetic spectators, that is us, aware of looking at the spectacle of violence. In this way, the film opens up its textual boundaries and creates an in-between space of encounter between actors/character and extra-diegetic audience, a space where forms of solidarity with victims might occur. On the other hand, the same strategy of including spectatorial reactions into the reenactment functions to express a self-reflective awareness of the limited potentiality of such encounters to fulfill educational aims that would result in reckoning with the past and taking responsibility for histories of violence in the present. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Diana, for an excellent presentation, and I must say that now I have to add Judith's filmography, I mean, to my watching list. I mean, because I did not know this filmmaker. I mean, but seems extremely interesting and relevant for what we do, and as well to what I personally study. I mean, in any case, I mean, moving forward, I mean, I'm very glad to introduce actually two speakers. I mean, because the next one is going to be a double presentation, and I am extremely pleased, I mean, and excited, I mean, to listen to the third talk, because directly address Italian culture, and in this case specifically the legacy of colonialism, but so again in a quite egoistic way. I mean, this is really a talk, I mean, that is relevant to my work, and I look forward to listening to. So the first speaker, I mean, is going to be Professor Charles Bardette, who is the director of the Institute of Modern Languages Research in London. And before joining MLR, Professor Bardette worked as professor of Italian studies at University of Cardiff, Bristol, and Durham. And his principal areas of research include literary culture under fascism, travel writing, and the legacy of Italian colonial presence in Libya and East Africa, as well as the representation of Islam and Islamic world in recent Italian literature and culture. Over recent years, a large part of the research of Professor Bardette has revolved around the necessity of reframing approaches to the study of modern languages through the enhancement of transnational and interdisciplinary perspectives. Among his publications, I can mention Journey Through Fascism, Italian Travel Writing Between the Wars, and Italy, Islam, and the Islamic World, Representations and Reflection from 9/11 to the Arab Uprising. The second speaker, I mean, of this double presentation is Gianmarco Mancozzo, who is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in modern and contemporary history at the University of Cagliari. Dr. Mancozzo received his first doctorate in Italian colonial history at the University of Cagliari, and has successfully defended his second doctoral thesis at the University of Warwick in 2020. His research interests deal mostly with Italian colonial history and culture, film production about the fascist empire and decolonization, the post-colonial presence of Italian communities in Africa, and the memories and legacies of colonialism in modern and contemporary Italy. He has published extensively on these topics, and is currently working on a monograph about fascist field propaganda about the Ethiopian War, which is meant to be published later this year. So the title, I mean, of their talk today is Ghost of Empire: Transnational Legacies of Italy's Colonial Past.
Thank you very much for that, Guido. I'm going to start, and then Gianmarco is going to follow, and I'll conclude briefly. In the context of a present that is shaped by the increasing proximity of cultural configurations and by continued instances of racially motivated violence, insight into the conceptual structure of colonialism and the continued influence of that structure is a matter of crucial and undeniable importance. We are impelled to examine how cultural and social structures remain haunted by the legacy of colonialism, by its hierarchical notions, its imposition of one set of practices over another, its fanatical elevation of a sense of national belonging, and its justificatory rhetoric, as well as the need to interrogate how systems for generating knowledge are implicated in histories that have facilitated, over extensive period of time, violence of both material and a conceptual kind. The 50 years of Italy's colonial activity have left indelible traces on those parts of the world where Italy was a colonial power. Conversely, we can understand little of contemporary Italy, or indeed the history of Italian mobility, without understanding the impact of the country's colonial history. Yet, only recently has Italian colonialism attracted attention that is commensurate with its importance. The chapter is not generally part of public consciousness and does not figure to the degree that it should in debates of urgent topicality, whether that concerns responses to migration or Italy's response to the BML movement. There are, of course, various means by which one can address this question. I'm going to look at one, and Gianmarco is going to look at another. One means of taking this analysis further is by looking at literary explorations of the topic. The rise in academic interest in the unresolved history of Italian expansionism has been accompanied by the appearance of literary texts that inquire into the colonial past and how that past continues to affect our experience of the world in which we live. To mention just a few key texts, in 2007, Gabriele Germandi published her novel Regina di Fiori e di Perle, Queen of Flowers and Pearls, on Ethiopian memories of the Italian occupation. Ijaba Shego has written on the transgenerational nature of the experience of colonialism in her work Adwa. In 2017, Francesca Melandri brought out her novel Sangue Giusto, The Right Blood. In 2019, Maza Mengiste published The Shadow King, a book that was shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize. The purpose of all these texts is to involve the reader in the creation of a world that lies between fiction and historical reality, to hear the voices of the people who belong to that world, and to experience their relation to the action that unfolds in the narrative. It is through the imaginative recreation of the lives of the characters that the reader is led into a spiral of questions on the nature of Italy's historical relation with East Africa. Within any society, the appearance of a stable and predictable succession of events is, of course, illusory. What the texts invite us to do is not to look for signs of continuity, but to look instead for signs of dynamic processes or temporalities that advance at a different pace and which overlap at different points. Thus, the writing leads us to develop insights into the way in which deep-laid processes are not simply observed as they occur across time, but how they operate through people's very mode of perception and cognition. We might indeed talk of a certain cognitive haunting. When the prevailing set of norms that underlie a given society begin to vacillate, not only does society start to lose its coherence and appearance as reality, it starts to assume the qualities of a spectral figuration, belonging both to past and present. But writers are rarely only writers. They tend to be journalists, filmmakers, and performers. All the writings to which I've referred are not simply sophisticated examples of literary communication, though they are, of course, that. They are, perhaps above all, powerful interventions within debates of enormous importance. The texts are a means of advancing understanding of how deeply people's lives are embedded within the paradoxes of transnational processes that occur across time. The texts enable us to see how the spectre of the past infiltrates and disturbs the present, how the individual can be shaken by the sudden apprehension of the way in which reality is structured, how subjectivity itself is necessarily relational. Writing of this kind can make us more alive to the nature of the material environment that we inhabit and the entangling of space and time. We become more conscious of how processes that we think belong to the past may be embedded in our very sense of self or within the social and cultural environments that surround us. This is a key point that is made in Melandri's novel Il Sangue Giusto and in the documentary Pagine Nascoste, Hidden Pages, which accompanies it in many ways. Both address the question of historical amnesia and the dangers of forgetting the past, and both have attained wide dissemination and recognition. In Melandri's novel, we discover the extent to which the father of the main protagonist, her name is Ilaria Profeti, participated in the occupation of Ethiopia and in the crimes which it perpetrated, with shattering effect for the way in which Ilaria sees the world and her place within it. What the action of Sangue Giusto is designed slowly to uncover is not the individual crimes of the occupation, but rather the racialist design at the heart of Italian imperialism. Yet the most startling revelation of the text is not the sudden apprehension of connections between different decades. It's rather that ideas and fantasies that are central to the biopolitical project of the 1930s cannot be viewed as belonging to the past, but need instead to be seen as operating, albeit in an altered and less recognizable form, within the cultural and social fabric of contemporary society. The past, in other words, exercises a mysterious, concealed, but nonetheless potentially menacing agency in the present. The colonial world ceases to appear as a reality that can be experienced only through archival records. The body of writing to which I've referred suggests the precariousness of individual identity. It intimates how the subject can be haunted by surmounted models of society, aware of the injustices of their framing of categories of race, gender, or class, and sensitive to the voices, whether they belong to the living or the dead, of those who experience the full force of a hostile social configuration. In Germandi's novel, Regina di Fiori, the notion of haunting is embedded in the very framework of the story. The narrator, Mallet, displays a gift for listening to the stories of the lives of others, and it is this gift that marks her out as suited to gathering the testimonies of those who lived through the Italian occupation of Ethiopia. The novel implies throughout that stories, to become meaningful, need to be constructed, lived through the emotions and the psychology of their listener. Many of the stories recount the horror of the Italian occupation at the very apex of fascism, and their effect is to haunt Mallet with images of implacable imposition of a social order. She becomes aware of how private memory can become public, of how the sustained violence enacted by the application of the race laws, though a feature of the colonial past, continues to stalk the present in the persistence of attitudes governed by the reliance on stereotype. She becomes aware of how intergenerational transmission is neither direct nor linear, and that the full complexity of transnational time is graspable only through narrative. And I'll pass the word now to Gianmarco to look at another vector of memory.
Thanks, Charles, and thank you, Guido, Selina, and Joe for this kind invitation. Talking about the transmission of colonial memories and on the relationship between their private and public dimension, but also the relationship between the material and immaterial nature of those memories. I would like to start with a rather personal anecdote. On November 2015, Charles and I were in Addis Ababa researching on the Italian community living there and on the legacies of the colonial past in the urban and social landscape of the city. We plan to visit the foreign cemetery, inside of which is the Italian cemetery, which was built in the Gulele area during the 20s, when many foreign communities like Greeks, Indians, Armenians, and Italians too moved to the new capital city of Ethiopia. And as soon as we arrived, we noticed a coming and going of elegantly dressed Italian people. They were preparing the mass to celebrate the National Unity and Armed Forces Day, the national day through which Italy commemorates the victory in World War I and more generally the national unity and identity. And we suddenly feel a strange feeling concerning the contradictory conflation of meanings related to that event in that specific site. The Italian community, mostly composed by people related to that colonial past, was commemorating the national unity, surrounded by graves of soldiers and workers who died in the attempt to build the myth of the fascist empire. So keeping alive that memory in that city made us think about the transnational nature of Italy's colonial memory. We observe the interplay between material and immaterial memories, between living and dead elements. In other words, the liminal condition of the colonial past, which is neither fully present nor fully absent, belonging to a ontological domain, of course, referring to Jacques Derrida's work. We were surrounded by the ghost of the Italian Empire. And I'm referring not so much to the bodies of the thousands of known and unknown soldiers who died during the Ethiopian War. Rather, the spectral presence of the, I'm quoting, unresolved histories of racial and ethnic oppression, end of quotation by Steve Krebs, haunted the spatial organization of that site. The different types of graves reflect the reasons that brought Italians to that part of Africa. On the one hand, there are the graves of people who arrived in East Africa at the beginning of the 20th century, when Italy formalized its colonial presence in Eritrea and Somalia. And such a limited flux of Italian settlers was composed mostly by business people, workers with different expertise, and missionaries. The fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and the subsequent declaration of the fascist empire brought significant changes in the political and social configuration of the Italian colonial society. Lots of people based in Eritrea and Somalia moved to Addis Ababa, which had to become the major city of the Italian East African empire. Together with them, hundreds of thousands of Italians, mostly soldiers, but also fascist workers and officials, moved to Ethiopia from Italy, seeking to realize the fascist revolution, seeking the place in the sun. However, what they found was a frail empire. Italian armies struggled to conquest Ethiopia. The local resistance never gave up. And throughout the 5 years of the fascist rule, the local partisans called Arbegnocci fought against the Italian presence vigorously. The thousands of graves of unknown soldiers recount the violence of an untimely war, the biggest colonial conflict in Africa, whose brutalities anticipated those of World War II. And this is because the Italian army did not spare the use of the most brutal war technologies like chemical weapons, concentration camps to crush the resistance. Furthermore, a regime based on racial segregation was implemented in the colonial cities to avoid any contact between white and black people. Such a violent imperial setting lasted only 5 years. On 5th of May 1941, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia returned to Addis Ababa, escorted by elements of the British Army. And the end of the Italian Empire of East Africa intersected with the most significant period of turmoil occurring in modern Italy, that is the fall of fascism and the national reconstruction following the Second World War. Italy's loss of its colonies was formalized via the signing of the peace treaty with the Allies in 1947. This de facto avoided the need for Italian politics and culture to come to terms with colonial crimes and usurpation. And during this rather peculiar, let's say, missed the colonial process, a substantial number of Italians remained in the now former colonies, especially in the Eritrea's capital, Asmara, and in Libya. During the 50s, when Eritrea was federated to Ethiopia, a number of Italians living in Asmara moved to Addis Ababa, where they took part at the urbanistic and economic development of the city. For instance, an Italian architect, Arturo Mezzerini, designed the African Union Palace and other institutional buildings. The traces of the fascist presence, still visible in some central areas of Addis Ababa, thus intercept the presence of post-colonial spaces related to the Italian community, like the Juventus Club, we can see here, on the Italian schools, for instance. The different stories of the Italian presence are clearly visible in those spaces, which have been, of course, resignified by post-colonial interactions and meanings, but which still bear the marks of a violent and unbarred past. Especially the cemetery and the celebration we attended to remains a site filled with contradictory meanings, in which the natural transition from a colonial to a post-colonial setting is somehow suspended. It's a heterotopia in which the boundaries separating the past and the present are uncertain, a site where the ghosts of the empire are questioning the very roots of our histories and cultures. The transnational yet ambiguous dimension of Italian colonial memories, which are simultaneously material and immaterial, is even clearer if you look at another heterotopic site, that is the former colonial museum in Rome. Last May, on the 25th of May 2020, the Museum of Civilization in Rome announced the reopening of the former colonial museum, now named the Italo-African Museum. And in my opinion, this name reiterates a pretty generic historical connection between a state, Italy, and the continent, Africa, so replicating also a very discursive colonial structure in terms of relationship and epistemic knowledge of the other colonial element. Whereas this name does not explicitly mention the colonial phase and the distinctive Eurocentric posture which informed the history of the collection housed in that space. Established in 1923, the museum was used as a main propaganda tool by fascism. The museum has been closed since 1972, and its objects were scattered between various institutes. These objects, in other words, are the uncomfortable memories of that past. The reopening of the museum aims to give a new status to these objects by exposing the violence hidden behind them. However, the inherently problematic nature of such material heritage might be exacerbated by the partially unacknowledged results of colonial legacies still haunting Italian society. Since the process of reopening is still at an early stage, we are convinced that this is the crucial moment to discuss the memory and the material legacies of Italian colonialism with the broadest audience as possible. In this way, the remediation and resignification of the imperial debris, and of course I'm quoting Laura Stoller, might be used to interrupt the process of ruination, which still corrodes our societies with colonial and racial discourses and practices. The ghost of the empire could, in other words, rest in peace only if we were able to expose their haunting presence in the ways in which we recollect the past to build the future. I pass the mic to Charles now.
Thank you. And just to conclude very briefly, the question is not so much how you proceed with your own work, but how you seek to bring together similar initiatives and exploit the resources that are available through funding mechanisms. So it is in this context that, together with a large group of researchers and partner organizations, we've put together a project on the ghosts of empire. The aim is for researchers to work with writers, artists, curators, and educators to address issues that concern how the memory of the colonial period is transmitted across generations, how the impact of the past can be viewed in contrasting perspectives, how colonial thinking continues within attitudes towards mobility and diversity, how creative engagement allows new voices to be uncovered and new interpretations to be pursued. The aim is to encourage public participation and co-production of knowledge, artifacts, and resources. The methodology of the project, which explores in comparative perspective the media through which knowledge of Italy's colonial history is transmitted and remediated, will be documented and disseminated through a series of workshops, seminars, and educational resources involving a large array of groups, associations, and partner organizations. At the center of everything will be the work of artists specially committed to remediate the collection of colonial era artifacts in Rome's Museum of Civilizations. This work will lead to an exhibition on the remediating of colonial representations. The exhibition will subsequently be presented in digital form to the widest possible impact. So hopefully we will be talking a lot more about this in the future, and we'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. I mean, and we hope, I mean, that we will be able to hear more from this wonderful project. I mean, which is both timely and important. I mean, for sure. I mean, for Italian culture in general, but even in a broader perspective. Okay, so thanks. First of all, thanks to all the speakers. I mean, also for respecting the time so well. We have 25 minutes. I mean, for the discussion. Joe will moderate the Q&A, especially with the questions that will come through the chat. I think we could already create many links, between the presentation, from Charles and Gianmarco and Alison work, on the museum. So there is lots to say on that. But before doing this, and while we wait, to receive questions from you in the chat, I will just ask briefly, something that can be addressed, more generally to all the speakers, and is a question around the idea of reception and critical reception, in the sense, that once we have these cultural products that circulate across society, what is, in your view, the role and the importance of the critical reception that movies, films, works of literature, and if we look at museums, we can even think about perhaps but even the reception of an exhibition, why not, on the press? So in general, how important you think it is, and how you see that it can have an effect in dialogue with the cultural products themselves. I would like to hear your reflections on that. Yeah, it's a question for whoever wants to reply. Yes.
We finished speaking, so it's probably easiest for us to just resume quickly on that subject and give the others a little bit more time. This has been, we've spent the last 18 months thinking about a project, putting a project together, applying for funding, and we'll see whether we're successful or not. But it's a mammoth enterprise. Now, the point is that if you're looking, say, at literary communication, then the reception of that and the patterns of reception, how they occur globally and nationally and internationally, are part of the equation that, as a scholar, you would address. Absolutely. In the project that we're looking at, one of the things that we're attempting to do is to see how you can put together a transmedial methodology, but at the same time, not just put that together, but do so in a way that is elaborated both with cultural producers, with curators and educators, and with the public and partner organizations. Therefore, to record the co-production of resources and the reception as you actually are engaged in a scholarly project. And I think that kind of work that we did with large grant transnationalizing modern languages was extremely valuable. And I think the idea of recording and charting and involving reception in the actual production of knowledge is an essential part of what we've been planning. I don't know, Gianmarco, if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I just want to add that sometimes when we confront with artistic products or exhibition or films or any cultural products, let's say, that dealing with critical themes, it's easier to find a kind of reception from an audience who is already ready to and keen to engage with that topic. The challenge now is try to cooperate with the largest audience in order to really spread this kind of reflection, not only at an academic level, but also at societal levels, and so on and so forth. So I think that is a question we already addressed in the drafting of the project, and actually we came across different ideas, and actually our main the backbone of our action is just to involve the more people, subjects, and groups as possible in order to really transform an academic reflection in an ethical and a critical standpoint from which address contemporary dynamics.
Yeah, thank you. If Diana and Alison would like to add something.
I don't know if Diana wanted to come in, but just briefly to say, I think it's essential, and it's in a sense what I was driving at the very end. So, our team is interdisciplinary to an extent, involving historians, archaeologists, digital people, and myself, and it is that sense of being the literary culture studies scholar, coming to that question that I think leads me to think that actually my work comes after you get some materials to work with and engage with and then transform at a later stage. So I agree with everything that Charles was saying. What I think is also worth bearing in mind perhaps is that I'm interested in this because I think sometimes we make claims about the agency and intervention of text that are hard to measure, and that this is a problem for memory studies if you know we think that something generates a lot of public interest, a particular product, and it's how we get from that to perhaps a change particularly is very hard to measure. And there are lots of ways to do it. So perhaps another way to tackle the question is actually to start with the platform and then see, and what I think is really important here is that question of what might actually we be doing here in creating these debates and opening up a space. And so I'm just slightly, you might sense, ambivalent about wanting to be responsible in terms of what we might be doing, even though it might be, you know, fairly small scale. So I think it's a fundamental point, but it's perhaps one that comes at what we need to come at from different disciplinary perspectives to see the questions that they each raise.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'm just going to quickly jump in here because Alison, you mentioned something about the agency of the text and the difficulty of measuring, you know, what a text can do. And partly the reason why I selected these two films is because it seems obvious to me that the filmmaker himself is aware of these issues. So when he first made the very mainstream kind of format, it's like that film was very well received in Romania, which is not the case usually with the Romanian films. Like people usually reject them, but this one exceptionally was well received. But instead of people talking about the issue of Roma racism behind it, they were talking about, you know, the spectacular aspects of it and this kind of immersive experience that people like, oh my God, finally we have a Romanian Western which is done so well. So then I think he picks up on this and then he turns it on its head and uses again the same mechanism of the spectacle, but in such a way that it makes the audience aware immediately that, you know, it's like, you know, you are watching something problematic, you are, you know, you're part of this whole story. But he's also self-conscious, so he's not showing, you know, this kind of, yes, people immediately reacting positively, knowing exactly what they are doing and what to take away from the spectacle. So that's why, yeah, I particularly enjoy these films. And yeah, I think it's an important question. And it's one of the questions that our project, the Translating Memory Studies, Translating Memories in Eastern Europe is trying to address as well. So obviously it's something that it's important for the memory studies in general.
Perhaps I can jump in, Guido, and I mean, pick up. There's a comment for Alison in the chat. I don't know if you've seen it, Alison. I don't know if is it Nila? Would you like to come in and comment on that, or Nila? Yeah.
Hi. Well, not really. I'm just having the experience of working on interdisciplinary projects in a memory studies field. The latest one is still having a tail a little bit. So it is an Arts and Reconciliation project between King's LSE and University of the Arts. And we have been brought in to kind of provide the emphasis on the arts in the project that is very much kind of driven by the political and human rights rendering of what reconciliation is. And it's been a nightmare working together because it's been very difficult. And on the other side, it was incredibly productive. For us as academics, it was a fantastic, fertile ground. But what did we achieve? I'm not really sure. You know, we had so many arguments and, you know, people stayed within their own discipline. We worked on a territory that is very contested. Sarajevo was the site of investigation. I don't think we helped anybody there in particular. So I think what Alison is saying is really important to take into account of how much we can actually do and how much those projects serve the purpose of developing our scholarly interests rather than doing much more than that. Really, we need to be honest about those kind of claims. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. I don't know if any of the speakers wanted to come back on that.
I suppose I should say I didn't mean to sound quite so negative or lack of potential. Maybe it's early in a project in what is a potential minefield. So and also I think bringing perhaps the cultural studies angle, I think we bring in a strong sense of reflexivity to things. And so I'm not trying to be at all negative, but I'm just trying to be quite reflective about what it might look like or where this might go and what consequences might be, as well as the enormous sort of potential that you might have to try, but not to make overclaims, I guess.
Thanks, Alison.
Can I just, I mean, that's a really good point, actually. I mean, I think this question of disciplinarity is, I mean, to engage in interdisciplinary work, one needs a sense of disciplinarity. One needs a sense of where you're coming at and what you are bringing. And I think that facilitates an interdisciplinary dialogue very much. People do stay within disciplines, but I think the idea of trying to work within large groups, in a sense, is to find the conversation that will, in some respects, take you outside of your comfort zone. And I think that's when you're thinking about the purpose of an interdisciplinary project within a wider field, you can sort of advance or think about the development of a disciplinary field if you are exploring those zones where you are outside of a comfort zone, and you can see where it might be possible to develop. And for example, working with curators who speak in the language of space and do so quite differently from literary scholarship does take you in a very different direction, but it of course enriches it, the series of ideas and approaches that you have. And that's very relevant to us in the IMLR, which is very much to facilitate and make bridges between conversations with the idea of how it is impacting upon a large and capacious disciplinary field in its sense. So your point is very well made. And it is something that working on a large grant does enable you to address very strongly.
Thanks, Charles. I don't know if Jana, you wanted to come in, or Gianmarco on that. Nila's just come back to you in the chat, Charles. I don't know if you want to pursue that in the chat, as it were.
Well, yeah, just quickly, absolutely. I mean, there are ways and means of organising projects. I mean, I don't know whether we'll get the funding to do what we want to do. I think one has to try. With TML, it was very important that my former large grant, transnationalising modern languages, the idea was very definitely that you need to be aware of these power structures and you need, in some sense, to combat them. So the idea that we worked through throughout was to have a horizontal mode of operandi and to be really following that and to make sure that there weren't imbalances in the way in which the work was done. But I recognise that that's a problem and it's something that one should be very conscious about.
Thanks, Charles. Gianmarco, did you want to come in on that?
Well, yeah, also because it relates to the question by Alessandra Ferrini, who I've read in a chat. Well, first of all, proposing a project based in the UK, which is looking at what's going on in Italy, allows us to maintain a kind of a great deal of independence in terms of what we are going to address. So there is an important element related to that. And personally, as an historian, and I see that the difficulties in what Alessandra calls art washing, in terms of maybe soften the racist and results of, for instance, the object that should be could be remediated in a museum. But as a historian, as a critical historian, my role is just to point out that history, that genealogies in the formation of that collection, and just try to provide a side gaze on what's happening. There are a lot of different perspectives that might be adopted, and only collaborating with different communities, not only based in Italy, but especially based outside Italy, and in particular with communities which have suffered the colonization, which perceive themselves as suffering the colonization, is the only way to address this kind of to avoid this kind of risk, or at least trying to avoid this kind of risk, and raising awareness of what the risks are, and also being critical with the institution which actually reproduce this kind of settings, which does not mean only about the colonial museum, but also the universities, also this plethora of institutions in which colonial discourse are nestled in.
Thanks, Gianmarco. I wondered, obviously encouraging people to raise their hands or pop questions in the chat. I wondered if I could jump in and ask a question that, in terms of what you just said, Gianmarco, about sitting outside a context and being able to take a kind of third view, kind of outside view, and it strikes me that is quite a privileged position that languages researchers can take in running these projects. I wanted to pick up on a point that Alison made about culture wars and the role of academics and the role of public history, and try and link those two things. And because it strikes me that in the kinds of debates that we're having at the moment, say in the UK, it has been very much historians working on UK topics that are kind of in the firing line, as it were. So I'm just wondering about, the possibilities of the kind of languages researcher, the looking outside as a means of kind of looking back in at one's own culture and the kind of value of that. So that's, I suppose a question to all of you, but perhaps to Alison first, if you don't mind, Alison.
Okay. I think it's a very fair point. I don't know. Well, first of all, I think to say, I suppose my unease perhaps it's not unease, it's just caution and care with what one may say and so on, goes more in the question, I suppose, towards what I, as an outsider, not just commenting maybe in a monograph, but having perhaps a wider public, should this get picked up as we hope it might to some extent, range. How one works, for instance, with Spanish archives, so we have a number of archives who are involved with this, how one places oneself in relation to that as an outsider. In my particular case, now the team is not necessarily all non-Spanish, but that's one thing I would say. I think the other thing that helps perhaps in this is that I approach a lot of these questions, and this is just an entirely personal or anecdotal element, but I've come to realize I probably approach a lot of these questions essentially as someone who's Irish and who grew up in Northern Ireland. And I think it's quite important that I remind myself that my view, for instance, of a peace process or a transition to democracy or whatever may well be colored by that. And I'm not sure there's much I can do to get out of that, but I think you're quite right. The modeling are good at moving across those cultural boundaries, and therefore, and we're not exclusively able to do this, but I think we're quite aware of those differences, and perhaps there's something to be drawn on in terms of doing that. In terms of this specifically, I'm not sure that I want to intervene in a UK debate, perhaps, although with some of the Chilean work, actually, so it's about Chilean refugees in the UK, it actually has a connection to UK refugee history, and one finds oneself in two very different worlds, working with Chileans thinking about their own history of migration and the reasons why, but also the UK history of that reception, and that they're two very different approaches, which I have found salutary and enlightening to take memory out of a book or out of a novel or film and to actually, even if it's small scale, low narratives of life, to hear those and what they mean in those different contexts. It makes one incredibly aware of precisely what you're actually saying. So I think there's a lot we can bring. Hard to systematize, perhaps, but a very important point.
Thank you, Alison. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on that.
Do you want to go first, Diana?
I only have a very general remark in terms of, these problems of, it's like the position as insider and outsider. And I've often heard it, like, for example, in transnational cinema, it's constantly the same kind of anxiety about, whether if I'm coming from a different background, then how can I actually interpret and understand the text? But there's always the relationality that is providing the bridge and the kind of special expertise. If somebody, is an expert in, reception studies, for example, then they can, pick and choose different films and then show a global, transnational trend and gain a lot of that out of that. So I think there's a lot of value in it, and it doesn't work against the national. It's just it works in, the national being always in contact with something else, which I think your presentation, Charles and Gianmarco, pointed out very nicely, and Alison's project is probably going in the same direction. So.
Thanks, Diana.
Absolutely, Diana. I agree entirely with what you're saying, Diana. What Alison is saying. Just to add one or 2 points to that is, I think with this kind of question, there are two things. One has to be constantly aware of one's own positionality, and then addressing the types of issues that we've talked about. I think it's very difficult to work singly on any of these topics, and that it is to be working with teams that are both inside and outside. An outsider is useful in that context. It addresses some of the questions that you raised, Alessandra. I know your work is very concerned with this, about the autonomy of the speaking voice. It's also, of course, when you're getting funding or attempting to get funding from a national provider, there is a question of how you are feeding into a debate of a national kind, which you have to address in terms of the way in which the funding mechanisms are there. And also absolutely thinking about academic beneficiaries and applications of your work in a wider methodological context.
Thanks, Charles. Gianmarco, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that? No? Is there another comment in the question? Ursula, I don't know if you wanted to come on very quickly. We're kind of coming to the end, so I'm about to hand back to Guido. But if you wanted to come on, I'm sure you can unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I can't get my camera to work, but it might just work in a moment. No, that just exactly what I said in the chat, really, that point about both being aware of one's own situationness and positionality, precisely what Charles was saying as I was typing, and then also just being really upfront about that, I think, is important. So bringing that to the table, it's obviously it's not enough to be aware of it and to be aware of it oneself, but to bring it out there and to make it part of that public debate is obviously really important as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ursula. I don't know if the speakers wanted to have one last word, or please feel free if you. Charles, were you going to speak?
No, I was going to say, well, no, we're absolutely fine not having last word, hopefully at the beginning of, but what is really important, as I say, from an IMLR thing, is very much to be thinking about bringing this kind of conversation together, and in such a way that you are trying to bring it in, to take Ursula's point, in not only your own positionality, but in the positionality within the institutional infrastructure and framework in which you work. And I think that is hugely important, and especially at a time of major contestation about arts and humanities work that we're going through nationally at the moment.
Thanks very much, Charles. I'm going to hand back over to Guido as we have come to the end of the time that we have today.
Yes, we came to the end of the session and to the end of the whole seminar series, but I think, I mean, that it fostered quite some interesting discussions. I mean, and then also the points, I mean, that Charles made about the kind of political activities that inevitably, I mean, we all have to carry out. I mean, in our profession, I mean, is still is going to give us some thoughts for the future and for future work. Too. I mean, yes. But so yeah, I would like to thank all the speakers first of all, and the participants for having been here, having listened to the presentation, and have attended perhaps even more than one seminar. It was a great pleasure. I mean, to run this session, and probably, I mean, the MLR will continue also with seminars of memory studies in the future. I mean, so in that case we will advertise them. I mean, yes.
Thank you, Guido, and thank you very much for curating this brilliant series on behalf of the Institute. Thanks.